Shadows that won't fade. My name is Crystal. I'm now 10 years old, but sometimes it feels like the weight of decades presses on my heart. Some nights all the noise quiets down and my mind replays the images, the ones I wish I could erase forever. These memories aren't like the stories you read in books or see on TV. They haunt in unexpected ways, bleeding through the borders of dreams and reality. Before that fateful night, I was just a kid trying to survive a pretty rough start in Kansas. My life was nowhere near perfect. Far from it, if you want the truth. But what happened at the Harris's house in Texas would force every cell of mine to hold on to life tighter than I ever thought possible. Now, my memories are a battleground. Pieces come at me when I least expect it. A cold shiver running down my spine on a summer afternoon, the squeak of an old floor, the distant hum of a neighbor's late-night TV. They all have the sharp edge of panic hidden within them, a quickening pulse that reminds me, no, I'm not just scared, I'm remembering. There are times when silence is too loud. I will lie in bed, eyes wide open, watching the ceiling patterns as if they could promise safety. My body recalls what my mind tries to block, the taste of fear, metallic in my mouth, the feel of the sheets tangled around my little legs, the way the moonlight threw odd shapes onto unfamiliar walls. Being 10 shouldn't mean knowing the different layers of terror, but it's become my reality. Sometimes in daylight, I pretend. My best friend says I'm brave, but she never saw what I saw. She never felt my heart turn to stone or my breath freeze when danger brushed so close I could smell it. She hears the facts. She doesn't know the toll those moments take under my skin, in the shadows I carry wherever I go. The worst is the guilt that follows, sneaky and powerful. Why did I survive? If I'd yelled louder, if I'd run faster, if I'd woken someone, would anything be different? The questions swirl in circles all night, pushing me away from sleep and into the exhausted limbo I now call rest. But still, every morning I get up. Somehow, each day I place one foot then the other on the floor. I comb my hair, I pack my school bag, I do the things everyone says are normal. Every new dawn is a chance to keep going, to untangle myself from the darkness little by little. Because as much as the shadows try to follow, I have to believe they won't win forever. I am more than what happened to me, even if, some days, the memories seem too heavy to fight. A turbulent American family past. The story of my family isn't the kind you see in holiday commercials, not even close. We were the classic case of American dreams twisted by reality, ambitions choked out by mistakes, longing weighed down by addiction. In the mid-90s, back in Wichita, Kansas, my parents, Marshall and Pamela, were two people struggling to survive their own storms. But while adults reach for shelter in different ways, their kids, us, have no choice but to ride out the chaos together. I was only 6 when my world began to truly unravel. My dad, Marshall, was stuck in the throes of substance abuse, his good days increasingly outnumbered by bad ones. My mom, Pamela, was fading under the pressure. She'd smile for us girls, but her eyes always looked somewhere distant, somewhere out of reach. I remember cold mornings in our old apartment, shivering at our tiny kitchen table with Mark and Amber, while Mom was nowhere to be found. She was either gone for work, at meetings for recovery, or just absent in her own sadness. My sisters and I would share a cup of instant oatmeal or stale cereal, and count down the minutes until sunrise. That oatmeal might not have tasted great, but it was warm, and ours. The hardest part wasn't the empty fridge or the worn-out shoes, it was the loneliness. I became the little mother, brushing my sisters' tangled hair, helping them get dressed in clothes that barely fit, and standing on tiptoe to microwave their dinners. I taught them how to pretend that we were okay, even when the loneliness grew so heavy it was hard to breathe. No birthday parties, no family outings. Mark and Amber followed my every move, trusting me because, in their eyes, I knew what I was doing. What they didn't know was that I was just winging it, desperate for a reassuring word or touch myself. At school, things weren't much better. There were whispers about those Sullivan girls, about the way we wore the same clothes for days and carried the scent of stale laundry or last night's dinner. I tried to keep my head down, hoping my teacher wouldn't notice my homework was late again. But kids notice everything. I learned early not to expect kindness, not at the bus stop, not in the lunchroom, certainly not in the playground games I was never picked for. Despite the coldness, I was fiercely protective of my sisters. Every scraped knee, every nightmare, every hunger pang, they ran to me first. I became their shield, imagining myself bigger and stronger than I really was. My heart would ache some nights when I heard them whispering about Mom. "Will she come home tonight?" Mark would ask. "I miss her," Amber would reply. All I could do was hold them, whispering empty promises that things would get better. What held us together was the hope faint but stubborn, that my mom would find her way back to us for good. And she did, after a lot of hard work and heartbreak. Looking back, those years forged us, tested our love, stretched our patience, and in strange ways, planted the seeds of resilience. The wounds from those days shaped us, but they also gave us a reason to keep trying, to claim whatever scraps of happiness life offered, and to make our own way forward together. Fragile hope and a relentless will to change. There was a moment, not a thunderclap, not a lightning strike, just a quiet, steady knowing in my mother's eyes that things couldn't stay the way they were. Years of stumbling through the gray fog of addiction had eroded nearly everything good in our family, but somehow, what survived inside her was a flicker of hope. Maybe it was all those nights she spent alone in our little apartment, listening to the soft breathing of her daughters and feeling the cold bite of reality. Maybe it was seeing the way I had become the caretaker, or seeing the sadness in Mark and Amber's eyes. But she made a promise, to herself and to us, that things would be different. Our journey toward change didn't begin with grand gestures or sweeping announcements. It began with tiny, almost invisible steps. My mom waking up a little earlier, making phone calls, attending counseling sessions. Rehab wasn't easy, and none of it happened overnight. There were relapses and tears, but little by little, there were changes. She started to come home on time, she made us pancakes for breakfast on Sunday mornings. She listened to Mark's stories, brushed Amber's hair with gentle hands, and remembered, for the first time in a long time, to laugh at the small things. The hardest decision my mom ever made was to leave my father for good. Their relationship had become little more than a set of shared regrets and mutual despair. When the divorce finally came through, it was both a heartbreak and a relief. But as she said, sometimes to find the light, you have to walk through the fire alone. With her newfound sobriety and determination, my mom started plotting our escape from Kansas, a place marked by too many broken promises. An old friend, Mrs. Harris, called from Texas offering a new beginning, the thought of a fresh start, a town where nobody knew about our past, where my sisters and I could lay down all the weight we'd been carrying, filled our hearts with something dangerously close to hope. Mom talked about Texas as a place where we could heal, where she could work without fear, and we could play without the constant undertow of shame. Even in the thick of moving boxes and tearful goodbyes, there was an energy in our home I hadn't felt in years. Dreams felt possible again. On the last night in Wichita, we sat on the worn living room carpet sharing takeout pizza, making promises for the future. My sisters and I curled up beside Mom, listening to her describe the sunshine and wide-open skies of Texas. She told us, "The past will always mark you, but it won't decide who you become." Her words stayed with me even as fear whispered that new places couldn't erase old hurts. We packed our lives into a few battered suitcases fueled by trembling hope and a relentless will to change, not just for a new address, but for new versions of ourselves. As the engine started, and our car pulled away from Kansas, I remember looking back only once. The wounds were still there, but somewhere in my chest was a hope, vulnerable but unbreakable, that life in Texas could finally let us breathe again. Early days in Texas, the dream of integration. From the moment we crossed the Texas state line, everything felt coated in newness, a dusting of hope over our battered spirits. The sky seemed wider here, impossibly blue during the day and alive with 1,000 stars at night. I clung to the words my mother spoke in the car, talking about fresh chances and new beginnings, determined to believe that we'd finally outrun our shadows. Our arrival in the small, sun-baked town of Del Rio was like stepping through an invisible curtain. It wasn't glamorous, but it was clean and friendly, nothing like the weary coldness back in Wichita. The Harris family welcomed us as if we were distant cousins finally making it home. Mrs. Harris had a quick smile and the kind of calm that made me feel safe, just standing near her. She immediately involved us in small routines, helping set the dinner table, folding laundry, sharing stories about the neighborhood. My younger sisters Mark and Amber were nervous at first. Mark gripped my hand everywhere for days, her new sneakers barely making a sound on the wooden floors. Amber, usually shy, clung to Mom, only letting go when she discovered that the Harris kids had a box of art supplies and a shelf full of picture books. For me, even the sway of the trees in the breeze felt like a good omen. At dinner time, all the children squeezed around a wobbly kitchen table, voices overlapping and laughter bubbling up until Mrs. Harris gently shushed us so we'd say grace. School was another world entirely. My first morning at Del Rio Elementary, I stood outside the brick building, clutching my backpack so hard my knuckles went white. I replayed all the stories my mom rehearsed with me, about how no one here knew our past, about how I could choose to let go of the girl who always wore thrift store coats and walked her sisters to class in Kansas. The classrooms buzzed with unfamiliar faces. Most kids gave us curious but polite glances. A few, sensing my hesitation, invited me to join in their games of Foursquare. Even the teachers had a softer edge in their voices, and though I stumbled once calling someone ma'am, no one laughed cruelly. Day by day our family slotted into the town's fabric like patches sewn onto a quilt. Our rented house, though small, never felt empty. The front yard exploded with dandelions, and the backyard had just enough space for Mark and Amber to play tag. We borrowed cake pans and garden tools from neighbors, exchanged nods in the grocery store, and soon it was normal to be greeted by name at the corner bakery. But for all the optimism, we still tripped over the weight of old fears. I'd wake in the night, listening for the creaks and whispers of an unfamiliar house, reminded that good fortune could be as fragile as spun glass. I saw it in the furrow of Mom's brow, how she double-checked the locks every night and paused a beat too long before turning out the lights. It was as if we held our breath, waiting to see if happiness would accept us or turn us away. Despite the anxiety lurking beneath the surface, those first weeks in Texas were our softest in years. We laughed, really laughed, at our first backyard barbecue. We grew used to the zing of salsa on our tongues and to the neighbor's silly chihuahua who barked every time someone rode by on a bike. Someone even gave Amber a blue ribbon at a school art show, and the look on her face made me want to believe just for a minute that problems could be left behind at the border between Kansas and Texas. Most importantly, we learned that it was possible to belong, little by little, neighbor by neighbor, story by story. The dream of blending into a new place had always felt like just that, a dream. But during those first days in Del Rio under the big Texas sky, it finally felt within our reach. The night of terrifying approach. That evening, as dusk melted into night, the house on Cedar Street was filled with laughter and the innocent chaos of children. The world outside was calm, wind whispering through pecan trees, distant car headlights flickering across the blinds, a neighbor's old radio fuzzily playing a country tune. Inside, it almost felt like we truly belonged, if only for a few fragile hours. Our bellies were full from a shared casserole dinner, and Mom let Mark, Amber, and me stay up a bit later than usual. It was the sort of ordinary joy I had only dreamed of when we lived in Kansas. As bedtime approached, Mrs. Harris tucked Katie into the bottom bunk, while I scrambled up to the top with an old soft pillow and a borrowed stuffed dog. The room was washed in the silver hush of a winter moon, the air crisp, the hush broken only by the soft snores of my sisters and faint adult conversations floating down the hallway. I felt light, safe, almost like I had always lived here and that life wasn't waiting to trip me up again. That illusion didn't last long. Even as I tried to drift to sleep, I caught a current of unease in the house. It was so quiet, almost unnaturally so. The radiator clicked and hissed, and somewhere under the floorboards an old pipe groaned. But I brushed it off, pulling my covers closer and telling myself, as I had so many nights before, that new places meant new rules for fear. I glanced over the edge of the bunk. They looked so peaceful, my sisters. I stared up at the ceiling, letting the strange shadows play across the walls, listening for any sound that felt out of place. When I finally closed my eyes, exhaustion tugged at me heavily, and I let myself slip into that weird space between waking and dreaming, the place where things felt both possible and vulnerable. That was when the energy in the room suddenly shifted, not a sound yet, just the strange sense that the world was holding its breath. Every child knows that feeling, even if they can't describe it, the prickle of skin, the way time slows. I remember rolling over, heart thudding, telling myself it was nothing, but deep down, a storm was gathering at the edges of my world, moving closer with every shallow breath I took. I had no idea that in just a few short hours our entire sense of safety would be stolen, and that everything we thought we'd escaped would come howling back to haunt us. Silent crimes and painful witnessing. The silence that draped the Harris household after midnight was thick and uneasy, the kind of silence that's almost a warning. A hunch that pricks the skin and unsettles the heart. Lying stiff on the top bunk, my breath shallow and careful, I listened to the ordinary sounds, the hum of the heater, the occasional shifting of one of the girls below, the ticking from an old clock in the hallway. But then, beneath the undercurrent of homey nighttime noises, there came a presence, something uninvited, something wrong, and I felt my whole body tense before my thoughts could catch up. I opened my eyes to a faint, warped light slicing across the wall, a luminescence not from the moon or the porch, but from a lamp newly flicked on, cold and foreign. My stomach dropped. The door, which we'd left cracked for comfort, stood ajar. And there, dividing the light from the darkness, stood a man I didn't immediately recognize. He was tall and broad, his clothes loose, blending with the shadows, his face eerily calm in this place of sleep and innocence. With every inch of his slow, purposeful movement into the room, I felt a pressure against my chest, making it almost impossible to breathe. At first my mind raced in disbelief. I needed, to believe it was a nightmare, or maybe a misunderstanding. Maybe Mrs. Harris had asked someone to check on us. Maybe I just didn't recognize him at first in the gloom, but a certain dread grew and solidified as the intruder moved closer to Katie's bed. He moved with a confidence, a sense of rehearsed purpose, that belied any innocent explanation. I couldn't speak, couldn't even whimper. My body was frozen in a static terror that I'd only read about in stories or seen in the eyes of wild animals. I watched as he leaned over Katie. She barely stirred before his hand clamped over her mouth, muffling what would have been the beginning of a scream. The struggle was short, brutal, and horribly quiet. He was strong. One gloved hand, then the other, and the awful metallic glint of a knife briefly caught the light. My world narrowed to the small patch of lamplight, the gasps, the frantic movement, and the sudden absolute silence as Katie stopped fighting. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to do something, to yell for help, to kick or throw something, to leap from the bunk. But terror kept me pressed flat to the mattress, breath after ragged breath barely moving my chest. My nails dug into the pillow, and the salty taste of tears pooled in my mouth, hot and shameful. I felt invisible and small, yet so exposed that I thought the man would surely see me, even in the half-dark. After what felt like a lifetime, he shifted his attention from Katie, scanning the room. For a terrifying moment he looked right at me. I squeezed my eyes almost shut, hoping my stillness would save me, that if I shrank small enough I'd disappear. But then I heard the bunk beds creak and he was moving again, soundlessly, inhumanly patient, his breathing quick but contained. He checked the other girls, my own sisters, his shadow looming over them before retreating. As he stepped back, I glimpsed a gloved hand smeared with something dark. Katie's blood. It was impossible to reconcile this horror with the warmth and laughter that had filled the house mere hours before. It struck me that evil wasn't dramatic or noisy. In that cold, silent room, it was methodical, deliberate, and it wore the face of someone who had once been welcomed into the fold of safety. The realization broke something open inside me, a shattering of trust so thorough I could actually feel it in my bones. He moved again, methodical as ever, checking around the room for signs of movement. There was a terrifying deliberateness to his actions. I didn't dare try to reach my sisters, though every fiber in me wanted to reach down, pull them up to safety, shield them from what had happened to Katie, and what might happen to any of us. But I stayed still. I had to. I don't know if it was primal instinct or sheer terror, but some voice deep inside me insisted, "Don't move, don't show him you're awake, don't make a sound." That voice saved my life. Long minutes passed. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs, a wild, frantic thumping that I was sure he could hear. I memorized every detail of the intruder's shape, catalogued each piece of him for reasons I couldn't name. Later I'd realize it was the mind's way of holding on to evidence, of recording critical truths when the body goes into survival mode. At the same time I wanted desperately to look away. I wanted this not to be real. Eventually, he seemed satisfied that no one else was stirring. He worked quietly, wiping surfaces, rearranging things. His hands were steady, his movements precise, far too calm for what he had just done. And still, I remained motionless, biting down any cry that might give me away. When he finally slipped out through the door, an overwhelming sense of dread overwhelmed my terror. The room was shrouded in unnatural stillness. I lay there paralyzed, crying soundlessly, until his heavy footsteps faded altogether. Only then, when I heard nothing but the regular ticking of the hallway clock, did I finally let myself exhale. The aftermath struck with violent clarity. The lamp threw grotesque shadows on the walls. Katie's small, lifeless form was just feet away from me. The silence was no longer tense anticipation. It was the oppressive weight of loss and trauma settling in, seeping into the air like a poison. For a fleeting moment, guilt crawled across my mind. Why hadn't I screamed? Could I have stopped him? But the logical part of me knew that any movement, any sound, would likely have led to my own death, or worse, the death of my sisters. Survival, I realized in that shattered instant, often looks a lot like doing nothing at all. Eventually, numb and shaking, I forced myself to check on Mark and Amber. I needed to make sure the nightmare was over, for now. Seeing their frightened but unharmed faces, I felt both flooded with relief and stung by new waves of sorrow. The memory of what I'd witnessed, every sight, every smell, every terrifying sound, burned itself into my mind, unerasable. In the far-off world of grown-ups, crime shows and detective novels always make catching the killer the gripping centerpiece. But no story could capture the hollow ache that comes from seeing evil up close and knowing, in that first raw dawn, that nothing will ever feel normal again. Our little group of children had become witnesses not just to violence, but to the destruction of the safety we once took for granted. Every bedtime, every shadow, every closed door would echo that single harrowing night. To witness an unspeakable crime and survive is its own strange kind of punishment. The weight of memory grows heavier, not lighter, as days pass, no matter what the adults say about time-healing wounds. But even amid that terrible darkness, a sliver of determination grew inside me. If I could remember every detail, if I could refuse to let fear steal my voice, maybe I could help bring justice, not only for Katie but for all of us who were left behind. That resolve is what carried me through the coming storm. The police questions, the hospital corridors, the endless battle to reclaim my ability to speak, and the hardest challenge of all, learning how to live, and eventually how to hope again, after looking evil square in the eye and choosing, somehow, to keep surviving. Miraculous escape, and the journey to find life. After the brutal silence that had shattered my world, what followed was not freedom, at least not immediately, but a suffocating, raw surge of panic and primal survival instinct. My body trembled uncontrollably. Every ragged breath came with the metallic taste of fear and blood. I lay for what felt like hours, seconds really, locked between the terror that Tommy might return, and the hope that if I just waited, the nightmare would end on its own. But no one was coming. There was only me, a child teetering on the edge of darkness and oblivion. Somewhere between consciousness and the urge to vanish, I realized I was alive. I remember the cold sting at my throat, the sticky warmth of my blood dampening the collar of a borrowed nightgown. Adrenaline, white-hot, flooded my veins. Some tiny, stubborn ember inside me whispered that if I didn't move now, this bedroom, once full of laughter, would become my coffin. Every instinct screamed at me, survive. I could not save Katie, but maybe, just maybe I could save the next girl, or my sisters, or myself. With agonizing slowness I peeled myself off the bed. The world wavered at the edges. My head spun. Every muscle in my neck and jaw screamed. I pressed a trembling hand to my wound and felt hot blood pooling between my fingers. I had read about people who fainted at the sight of blood. My own didn't make me faint. It made me furious, a private rage against the injustice that had torn a hole through our new life. I slid out of the top bunk and landed hard on the floor, the jolt nearly making me cry out, but I bit my lip fiercely. The house was silent, a heavy, suffocating silence. I had no idea where Tommy was. Every shadow loomed dangerous and alive. My sisters slept, mercifully unaware of the carnage mere feet away. I knew I needed to reach them, but even more, I needed to get help. If the monster was still in the house, any sound could bring him back. I crept across the room, movements awkward and jerky from pain and panic. The smell of blood and fear hung thick in my nose, mixing with the memory of casserole and clean sheets, a contrast too cruel to process. In the hallway, every step felt like a lifetime. The wooden floor creaked softly, and I froze, heart thundering, convinced that at any moment Tommy would appear again. But the house remained unnaturally quiet. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with secrets and sorrow. Downstairs the front door called to me, a bright line of moonlight on the threshold, a possible escape. But even the act of turning the knob felt like climbing a mountain. Pushing the door open, the cold Texas night hit me in a wave, bringing with it the sound of wind, distant barking dogs, and the most beautiful everyday thing of all, the world outside was still turning. I stumbled onto the porch, one hand clamped firmly to my throat, vision blurring at the edges. The pain tried to drown me, but some miraculous determination let me keep moving. I willed myself forward across the frozen yard. My bare feet went numb, lights flickered in houses up the street, normal people's lives still untouched by this terror. I didn't try to think. Thinking was a luxury for the safe. All that mattered was moving, making myself visible, refusing to become another silent victim. The neighbor's porch was a lifeboat in the darkness. I banged on the door with the last of my strength, leaving smeared, bloody fingerprints as proof of my presence, my demand to be saved. The door swung open, shocked faces looming above me, someone screaming for help. The rest unraveled in flashes, blankets pressed to my neck, a frantic call to 911, the dizzying descent into unconsciousness as my body finally surrendered its borrowed strength. In that moment, drifting in and out of awareness, I remember snatches of sensation. The scratch of wool against my skin, the tinny edges of ambulance sirens, an oxygen mask over my mouth, words I could not answer. I was somewhere between this world and the next, but I was alive. I had endured. The hospital lights were harsh and glaringly bright. Nothing could be further from the warmth of a family home. Here I was surrounded by strangers in scrubs, the beeping of machines, the sterile scent of antiseptic and metal. Voices spoke above my head in urgent, clipped tones. There was so much blood, so much pain, and I was too weak to do anything but let their hands move me, stitch and bandage, whisper that I was a miracle. I understood little, except a low, relentless ache inside. Will my sisters be safe? Is my mother alive? When I awoke after surgery, my throat burned raw and alien. I couldn't speak. Panic seized me again. Silence felt too much like death. But the nurses, eyes kind but haunted, taught me how to scribble messages on a legal pad. I scrawled question after question. My sisters, Mom, where are they? Did he get away? Piece by piece, the answers filtered in. Mark and Amber, shaken, traumatized, but alive. My mother, wild with fear and grief, never left my bedside. I learned that help had come swiftly. The police were already searching. I wanted desperately to talk, to warn, to explain every detail. But what the crime had stolen from me, my voice, the pen and paper would have to replace. What came next was a blur of tests, interviews, and interventions. I had become both a survivor and a key witness. My testimony living proof that monsters didn't only dwell in stories, they walked in the shape of someone trusted. There were moments, late at night when the hospital ward was silent, that I wondered if surviving was really the miracle everyone called it. Survival wasn't an end, it was a series of choices. Every hour my aching body and wounded spirit had to choose again, not to collapse back into fear, not to turn my face from truth. But hope crept in, quietly as dawn. Nurses brought handmade cards from schoolchildren. Orderlies gave me silent thumbs up as I shuffled to physical therapy, tubes trailing from my arm. My mother's hands were always there, cool, trembling, fierce. She spoke to my heart, even when my ears didn't quite understand, about how bravery didn't mean not being afraid. It meant acting anyway, even with tears in your eyes. Some nights memories invaded, the scrape of his shoes, the glint of moonlight, the shadow bending over Katie. My dreams were filled with running, with screaming that only echoed inside my own head. But each morning I woke up, a fact that felt for a very long time like a tiny rebellion against what Tommy had tried to do. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, life began to expand outward again. Each day I sat up a little straighter, learned something new about my own strength. I was patched together in too many ways to count, but the miracle wasn't that I hadn't died. The miracle was that after all of it, I was determined to live. That fierce spark inside, a stubborn, unbreakable will, carried me through the darkness and toward the glimmer of a life remade, not despite what happened, but defiantly in answer to it. A tense investigation, and the pivotal testimony. After the night when everything irreversibly changed, the world became a flurry of sirens, blue and red lights splashing against the Texas dawn, and strangers tramping through the Harris home in uniforms and latex gloves. Even as my body fought to heal in the hospital, my mind hovered restlessly on the threshold of that house, caught between the memory of horror and the questions swirling around what would come next. The details of that night clung to me, vivid and raw, and I knew even before the detective spoke to me that they'd need every scrap of what I'd witnessed if there was ever to be justice. The investigation began in that oppressive hush after tragedy. Officers sealed rooms with yellow tape, cataloging evidence down to the smallest trace, a sliver of fabric, a partial footprint in the backyard mud, a single red thread snared on a nail. The living room where we had laughed just hours before now reeked of solvents and tension. In soft, practiced voices, the police explained to my mother that every detail mattered. No one touched anything, not the toys scattered across the carpet, nor the lopsided stack of library books by the bunk bed. It struck me, lying in a sterile hospital bed, that the world outside kept moving while we were frozen in one awful moment. Back at the hospital, I was both a patient and a crime scene. My hands shook with fever from painkillers and fear, but I wanted desperately to help, to fix what had been broken, if only by telling the truth. But my voice, still ragged from surgery, wouldn't answer when the detectives first visited. Instead, they slid a bright yellow legal pad and a pen across my tray table. "Anything you remember," they urged gently. "Even if it's small, it matters." I tried to shape my memories into words. The angle of the lamp's eerie glow, the hissing radiator, how the intruder's breath sounded, quick but measured, as he moved from one sleeping child to another. I wrote about the heavy weight of his gloved hand, the metallic glint of his knife, the way terror renders you mute even when you want to scream. No detail was too small. I sketched rough outlines of his build, wrote trembling descriptions of his clothes, the way his belt buckle gleamed as he leaned over Katie. Whenever a chill shuddered through me, my mother gripped my hand, anchoring me to the now, reminding me I was safe, for the moment. Detectives came and went, always with notepads and soft voices, sometimes taking my hand or offering me a cup of ice as if they could thaw the numbness inside me. In the following hours, and then days, I retold the story over and over, first to a pair of Del Rio officers, then later to officials from neighboring counties, and, finally, to a grim-faced woman who told me she was a forensic artist. She quietly sat up at my bedside with a sketchpad, asking me to describe everything with careful attention to how I remembered the man's face in flashes, his square jaw beneath the shadow of his cap, the coarseness of his stubble, that unsettling calm in his eyes as he swept the room for threats. It was more exhausting than any physical pain, reliving that terror on the blank canvas of a stranger's pad. My throat ached and my hands cramped from writing, but every mark I made, every clarification or hesitant nod, helped bring the man who shattered our world into sharper focus. The artist showed me different sketches, like this, maybe the nose a little longer, until something in my chest seized with dread. She found the face, the one that matched my nightmares. Meanwhile, outside my hospital room, the gears of the investigation ground relentlessly forward. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking about strangers in the area or suspicious cars. Neighbors who'd welcomed us days before now mourned beside us. Some brought meals to the hospital, their plates wrapped tight in foil, as if food could comfort the bewildered and grieving. The Harris family answered questions too, painfully, honestly, tracing through every detail of that night and every adult who'd had access to the house. As news of the crime traveled through Del Rio, the air shifted. What had been a safe, sleepy town bristled with whispers. A curfew fell quickly, and even the boldest children stayed close to their parents. Reporters staked out the hospital lawn and local news cycles ran stories about the Del Rio tragedy, the phone ringing so often that a nurse began screening the calls. But inside, our own small universe of fear and determination turned quietly around the need to identify and catch the man who had shattered more than one family's peace. The crime scene team returned more than once, hunting for fingerprints that might have escaped the killer's careful touch, swabbing for DNA on the door frames, and collecting every scrap of fiber or smudge of blood that could become a clue. They asked for the nightgown I'd worn, the sheets from the bunk bed, even the pillow I'd clutched to my face during the worst of it. I learned how loss comes in layers. You lose your innocence first, then your comfort objects, and then finally, maybe, your belief that monsters don't exist. Through it all, I became the center of the case, not because I was brave, but because I had seen what so many could only guess. Police said my eyewitness account and the sketch it produced were the most valuable guides they had. Everyone wanted me to remember. I just wanted to forget. Sometimes, when the days blurred into night, I wondered what it would be like if I could close my eyes and erase everything but the soft, kind voices of the nurses or the steady presence of my mom at my side. Yet, each day pressed forward with new questions and needs. Detectives asked again and again, had I ever seen the man before? Could I remember his voice even in whispers? Was there a scent I associated with him, a cologne or a faint trace of cigarettes? I searched my memories, sifting for truths amid trauma-shrouded fragments. The only thing I became certain of? The attacker was not a random stranger. There was a confidence, a knowledge of the house's layout, a chilling ease with the darkness that said he belonged, or thought he belonged, here. My recollections, though scattered and incomplete, became the tent poles of the entire investigation. While doctors monitored my vital signs and therapists began gentle trauma counseling, the police worked day and night to compare my memories with reports about anyone connected to the Harris family, a handyman, a relative, a trusted friend. Rumors swirled, and each breakthrough seemed to ripple through the hospital. My mother would catch snippets of conversations from police in the hallway, and all of us held our collective breath with every knock on the door. Eventually, after days that felt like lifetimes, the forensic sketch and my written testimony converged with physical evidence. A neighbor remembered a strange car parked on the block for several nights running. Another child reluctantly admitted seeing an unfamiliar man near the house days before. The records of those who had been in and out of the Harris house, even just once, were scrutinized and filtered for matches with my memory. There were tense late-night meetings, and officers who looked me straight in the eye and promised they would not let this story end with the killer at large. The energy in my hospital room changed from despair to grim hope. My sisters visited quietly, holding onto my hands as if their touch could protect me from lingering ghosts. The ache in my throat, constant reminder of that night, meant I shared most of my stories through writing, always searching for the missing puzzle piece that would make sense out of terror. The turning point came when someone finally compared the forensic sketch to old photographs from family albums in the Harris's circle of acquaintances. Faces that had once brought laughter at backyard barbecues were suddenly viewed with suspicion. When my mother, face pale with exhaustion and fear, brought in an old Polaroid, I knew, before she spoke, that the face in the picture matched the one I saw that night. The room went silent as my trembling finger pointed to the man in the photograph, the family friend who was more monster than companion. The police moved fast after that. DNA from evidence at the scene was rushed to a lab. Testimony from the neighborhood narrowed the suspect pool. All the while I repeated my story, over and over, until it was muscle memory, threading the shaken certainty of a child survivor into a tapestry investigators trusted with everything. In those days, I discovered the strange weight of responsibility, how a few words on paper, a simple drawing, could shift the fate of the entire case. Detectives told me they'd built their timeline around my memories. "You are the key," they said, and for a moment I was both honored and deeply afraid. My memories cost me sleepless nights and anxiety, but every time I doubted myself, my mother reminded me that Katie and all the other children deserved my truth, no matter how much it hurt. At last, the case moved forward quickly. Warrants were issued, a suspect was arrested, and the community braced for a tidal wave of shock, betrayal, and relief. For me, the investigation left imprints as lasting as my wounds, a new understanding of resilience, the gravity of telling the truth, and a belief that even the smallest survivor's voice could bring about justice. In the end, I was not alone. The love of my family, the support of gentle strangers, and the relentless determination of law enforcement formed a net that, against all odds, helped keep the shards of our broken world from splintering further, revealing the identity and name of the criminal and the painful betrayal. The moment of revelation was less like a thunderclap and more like a slow, suffocating fog rolling in, thick and undeniable. For days, maybe weeks, suspicion had tiptoed around the edges of our world, but when the truth finally surfaced, when the detectives summoned us into that cramped hospital conference room, the air itself seemed to grind to a halt. I sat between my mother and a social worker, their hands gripping mine so tightly that my knuckles went white. The lead investigator's voice was gentle but raw. "Crystal, we believe we know who did this." Somewhere deep down, I must have already known. The forensic sketch, my patchwork memories, the way the man moved through the house as if he belonged, it had all pointed to someone close. But nothing had prepared me for the gut-wrenching shock when they laid the photograph on the table and spoke his name out loud. Tommy. Tommy, the Harris family's longtime friend, the man who'd fixed our fence last week, who shared barbecue with us in the backyard, who tousled Mark's hair and called us the crew. My world crashed in on itself as if every memory had been rewritten in a darker, meaner ink. My mother gasped, a sound that seemed to scrape up from somewhere under her ribs. Mrs. Harris, who had been a lifeline to us since our first day in Texas, was pale and silent, her hands trembling so hard her wedding ring rattled against the table. Betrayal leaked into every breath. How could someone who understood our daily routines, who carried our stories, who seemed utterly safe, how could he unleash such horror? I felt a strange, dizzying kind of grief, not just for Katie or for our lost innocence, but for the lie we'd been living under. The walls themselves felt complicit. Had Tommy been in this room laughing at our kitchen jokes while plotting something unspeakable all along? Detectives filled in the gaps we never wanted to imagine. Tommy had easy access to the house, often helping out or arriving unannounced. He knew the layout, knew who would sleep where. He'd earned trust, not just from Mrs. Harris, but from all of us. As the truth unfolded, every ordinary kindness twisted into something sinister. The way he'd carried in groceries, the late-night chats on the porch, his too familiar questions about where we stored our spare keys. Mark's innocent drawing of Mr. Tommy taped to the refrigerator flashed through my mind with a sudden, searing pain. How many times had he looked at that picture before slipping into the darkness? The pain of betrayal festered in the days that followed. The community recoiled in disbelief. Neighbors whose doors were always open now double-locked them. Rumors hissed through the halls at school and the local grocery. For Del Rio, Tommy's arrest was not just the unmasking of a monster but the gutting of a communal trust. For the Harris family, and for us, it was a private earthquake. Everything we'd believed about friendship, safety, and neighborliness was suddenly suspect. My mother kept replaying moments, small, mundane flashbacks like offering Tommy a cup of coffee or watching him patch the front gate. She wept, shoulders shaking, as each memory sharpened into something close to shame. Mrs. Harris, usually so steady, withdrew into herself. She passed long nights perched at the kitchen table, staring at the wall, lips moving silently in prayer or anger. We all struggled with the same gnawing regret. How could we not have seen? Were there warning signs buried in kindness? How could evil hide so well under the mask of ordinary decency? I found myself obsessing over every detail. Had Tommy ever looked at me differently? Did he linger in doorways? Could I have warned someone somehow? The guilt was thick and sticky. It crept into my dreams, slowed my steps, made every memory feel dangerous. Even comfort became confusing. I hated him, feared him, but sometimes I caught myself missing the sense of belonging he'd helped create. That confusion churned in my stomach alongside the rage and horror. When the news finally broke to the wider world, everything accelerated. Reporters camped outside the hospital, desperate for a family photo, some small token of sorrow to pin to their headlines. Headlines screamed words like betrayal, shattered trust, and small-town nightmare. Some neighbors lashed out, convinced the Harris family had been reckless to trust someone like Tommy. Others rushed forward, bringing casseroles and gentle reassurances that none of us could have known. But compassion felt hard to accept, tainted as it was by our own disgust at having welcomed a monster across our doorstep. Law enforcement briefed us daily as the case built around Tommy. His alibi crumbled under the weight of evidence. Security footage showed his truck near the house. A receipt placed him buying gloves and a cheap pocket knife just days before the attack. All the fingerprints, the DNA swabs, the timelines, each confirmation felt like a new wound. There had been signs, maybe, but only in hindsight. Crystal clear patterns lined up only after the damage was done. The worst part for me was not just the fear or the anger, but the complicated grief that followed. Loss was something I thought I understood, losing my sense of family, my father to addiction, the home in Kansas that never felt safe. But this was a different beast. I felt cheated, as if the possibility of trust itself had been stolen from me. Every act of kindness now came with a trace of suspicion. Every smile from a neighbor flickered against the image of Tommy, transforming warmth into warning. Sometimes in the hospital, between interviews with detectives and therapy sessions, I'd replay the moments before the night of the attack, the jokes we'd shared over hot chocolate, Tommy's laugh mixing with ours, the way he carried himself as part of the family. Those memories, once precious, became poisoned. And yet beneath the disgust, something else grew, a fierce will to protect others, to see without blinders, to remember that monsters don't always come in the shape we expect. The Harris family suffered in their own way, guilt painting shadows under Mrs. Harris's eyes and stealing the lightness from her voice. She questioned every judgment she'd ever made, swinging between blaming herself and swearing never to let anyone that close again. Other adults around us, teachers, coaches, family friends, reacted with the same shell-shocked disbelief. They spoke in hushed tones about background checks, about the dangers of openness, about how evil sometimes wears a familiar face. I saw grown men cry in the courthouse hallway, their faith in the world broken alongside ours. For me, the revelation of Tommy's identity became both a curse and its own kind of clarity. Yes, the horror was deeper because it came from within our circle, from someone who called us friend. But knowing the truth, pinning the crime to a name and a face, also meant an end to the suffocating uncertainty. The shadows in my memory finally sharpened into something I could name, point at, and ultimately resist. The agony of betrayal left scars, but it also gave me a guide for what to watch for next time. Not just evil acts, but insincere smiles, boundaryless questions, patterns that, if seen through a different lens, might have sounded an alarm earlier. The fallout stretched for months. long after Tommy's arrest. News coverage was relentless, the shockwave rippling through Del Rio and into surrounding towns. Therapists visited our home, leading painful but necessary talks about trust, about forgiveness, about the difference between caution and paranoia. Some days I'd wake and nearly believe things were normal. Then I'd see Mrs. Harris flinch at a knock at the door, or my mother stare too long out the window, and I'd remember, some wounds cut so deep they change the way you see the world forever. In the end, the unmasking of Tommy was both an ending and a beginning. His arrest marked the closure of our worst fears, but it also left us standing in the rubble of our old beliefs. We learned, painfully, that evil wears ordinary faces, that even the kindest families can be deceived, that betrayal can come from where you seek comfort. But in naming our betrayer, we also reclaimed a measure of power. We turned the darkness back, if only a little, by refusing to stay silent any longer. And for that, for the chance to speak truth against the shame and the heartbreak, I found a strange, stubborn hope. Maybe one day, the hardest lesson of all would become our greatest shield. The dark past of a murderer. Tommy's past was a twisted road paved with secrets, half-truths, and the kind of darkness that rarely saw the light, until it was already too late. When the police started pulling at the loose threads of his history, a tangle of trauma and violence unraveled that shocked even the most stoic investigators. Every new revelation felt like a cold slap, not just for us, the families who had once trusted him, but for the whole community that had unknowingly welcomed a storm in human skin. Tommy had grown up in a rundown pocket of North Texas, bouncing between foster homes and disgruntled relatives. The police report, dry and clinical, ticked off incidents from his childhood: fights at school, pets found hurt or missing, an uncanny knack for lying about everything from homework to missing cash. Even as a child, he'd learned how to manipulate, how to charm the adults in charge just long enough to avoid real consequences. Social workers described him as bright but deeply troubled. Teachers marked him as emotionally volatile. What nobody realized, or nobody wanted to admit, was that Tommy's early violence was a warning more than a phase. By 12, he'd graduated from small acts of cruelty to breaking and then entering nearby abandoned houses. By 14, he was already drinking, his school records a blur of suspension slips and hastily filled-out transfer forms. One neighbor remembered finding stray animals hurt in the alley behind Tommy's uncle's house, but in small towns, suspicions were often buried under politeness. Boys will be boys, some said. He's just misunderstood, others clucked. In the end, damage hid behind a mask of rural anonymity. He drifted through his late teens in and out of trouble, caught stealing, starting fights, even suspected in the disappearance of a local stray dog. Police could prove nothing, but whispers followed him everywhere. Tommy learned how to keep his head down, how to be helpful when it counted, how to apologize with a crooked smile and eyes that rarely met yours head-on. Underneath the show of repentance was a simmering anger, a fearsome resentment aimed at anyone happier, wealthier, or more loved than he believed himself to be. His criminal record truly began to swell after high school. Small-time burglaries, a DUI, a few nights in the county jail for bar brawls. But no one crime ever seemed big enough for the system to intervene decisively. He drifted. Odd jobs, shady friends, always on the edge of disaster. When his mother died, the last shreds of stability vanished. He tried rehab twice, but quit, blaming the world out to get him. Each time he relapsed, his bitterness grew. The details spilled out in police interviews, Tommy railing about second chances, about being overlooked, about how everyone deserved misery just like his. The cruelty in Tommy's life wasn't just aimless violence, it was methodical and practiced. He learned to spot the people most likely to forgive, or to ignore the warning signs. The elderly neighbor who needed her yard mowed, the single mom desperate for a handyman, the little kids who didn't know any better. In police files there were notes about women who'd reported feeling watched late at night, about break-ins that left nothing missing except a sense of safety. Sometimes the whispers trailed after him, but Tommy always seemed to slip away when suspicion grew too strong. It was during one of his many stints in town, working for a construction crew, patching up fences, blending into the patchwork fabric of the community, that Tommy met the Harris family. He arrived with a reference from an old friend. In small towns, a friendly handshake covered a multitude of sins. His criminal past was largely invisible, hidden behind the petty crimes that never made it onto a thorough background check. What wasn't documented in police logs was carried like fog, a reputation for being troubled but trying, always just a breath away from a fresh start someone hoped might finally stick. But Tommy knew how to play a part. He showed up early, volunteered for odd jobs, made jokes at family barbecues. He made himself useful, he made himself indispensable. For a time, he was the guy everyone called when something went wrong. No one thought to question how quickly he learned the routines of every house, or how he always seemed to know when husbands were out late, when back doors were left unlocked, when children changed bedrooms without anyone announcing it. His keen sense of observation, once used for small-time thefts and pranks, turned into something more sinister, the predatory patience of a man determined never to feel small or powerless again. The most chilling revelations about Tommy's past weren't what he'd left in a file or a rumor, but the faces and voices that surfaced only after his arrest. An ex-girlfriend, just 16 when she dated him as a teen, stepped forward trembling. He'd stalked her for months after their breakup, leaving notes under windshield wipers, appearing outside her window in the dead of night. A former employer recalled missing cash, missing tools, and, most haunting, an overnight break-in while his family slept, chalked up to coincidence at the time. Several townsfolk, emboldened by the horror of his exposure, came forward with memories they'd long suppressed. The way he lost his temper when cornered, the flashes of violence in his eyes, the uncomfortable comments made to women or children that had sounded strange but not quite criminal. Until now. Perhaps the cruelest part was that many of Tommy's warning signs fit the mold of countless other aimless drifters, men with hard luck stories and rough edges, given chance after chance by kind-hearted, hopeful people. It wasn't just that he deceived the Harris family, or us, he deceived a whole system built on giving second chances. The realization sent a ripple of anger and self-blame through those who had vouched for him, opened their homes, lent their bedrooms or backyards to his safekeeping. How could they have known the darkness he carried so quietly within? After the arrest, the police dug deeper, cross-referencing old cases with Tommy's movements. Sudden patterns emerged. Unsolved burglaries, hushed-up incidents in trailer parks, a possible assault never pursued because the victim was too frightened, or too ashamed, to come forward. His portrait in the final police dossier was monstrous not because of one single act, but because of a lifetime of small cruelties, building toward a night so evil it seemed almost preordained. Psychologists brought in to review his record offered an unsettling clarity. Tommy had the hallmarks of a classic predator, a capacity for mimicry, a charming disguise, an emotional vacuum when it came to other people's pain. In therapy sessions and interviews, he explained away nearly every episode, never once accepting fault. "I didn't have much of a chance," he told a detective, "when everyone decided I was trouble since I was 6 years old. Maybe at some point there was a lost boy deserving of pity in that story. But what emerged as threads were pulled tighter was a man who'd made 100 choices to escalate, to inflict, to destroy. There were prison records too for short stints, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, a stint for theft that lasted less than a year. But judges, worn down by caseloads and Tommy's ready tears, often gave him lighter sentences, or let him walk after community service. The system wanted to believe in redemption. Tommy simply learned how to perform it. In one chilling note, a former probation officer wrote, "He is a master at telling you exactly what you want to hear, but watch his eyes. He only gets softer when he talks about himself." His past finally caught up to him in Del Rio, in a tragedy so explicit and so horrifying it could no longer be covered by excuses or hope. The crime, the murder, the attempt to destroy innocent lives in the night, was not born out of a single rage, but the culmination of years of hidden violence and sadism. Reconstructing his life, you saw not a sudden explosion, but a fuse that had been burning for decades. One careless oversight, one too easy forgiveness at a time. In the aftermath, the question everyone whispered was the same. Could someone have stopped Tommy sooner? Could a teacher, a neighbor, a cop, a judge, have recognized where his path was heading? Some said yes, that the system failed not only his victims, but Tommy himself by refusing to admit how truly dangerous he was. Others, quieter, confessed that evil sometimes hides in plain sight, disguised by jokes, overshadowed by personal tragedies, made invisible by our own reluctance to see the worst in those among us. For me, learning the extent of Tommy's darkness was both terrifying and strangely clarifying. The knowledge that his evil had so many warning signs, summed up by a lifetime of stolen trust, whispered threats, overlooked crimes, meant that our tragedy wasn't only rooted in that single shattering night, it was the bitter fruit of many years of willful blindness, misplaced kindness, broken systems, and unhealed wounds. Tommy's past stands as a brutal lesson about monsters. They are seldom creatures of myth or legend, but rather, broken people given chance after chance to practice cruelty without consequence. His story, stitched together out of 1,000 ignored warnings, became the grimmest cautionary tale our community would ever know. And it leaves us all with the hardest question to answer. How do you keep faith in the possibility of redemption after seeing so clearly where mercy can go tragically wrong? Trial and the power of a young witness. The courthouse in Del Rio didn't look like the epicenter of a seismic, life-altering moment, but to me, every inch of the faded brick facade seemed charged with an impossible kind of electricity. Months had swept by since the night my childhood was torn in half. Texas heat shimmered off the blacktop as reporters clustered outside, clutching their microphones like weapons. My mother's hand, strong and trembling, led me through the crowd. I was still a child by every measurement, barely reaching the bench in the witness stand, but I was about to play a role larger than myself. From the first day, the air inside the courtroom was tight with anticipation and judgment. Lawyers in crisp suits shuffled stacks of paper, while local families packed every seat, some there out of sympathy, some for closure, and some perhaps carried by pure, ghoulish curiosity. The investigators and attorneys had prepared me for this day, but nothing could truly brace a 10-year-old for the moment when she would have to relive in agonizing detail the violence and betrayal she had witnessed. When my name was called, my legs wobbled so badly I worried I'd fall. Still, my mom's soft whisper from the gallery, "You're brave, you are truth itself," gave me just enough strength. The judge, a stern man with tired, careful eyes, asked if I understood why I was here. I nodded. The prosecutors had repeated over and over that my words could help deliver justice. My testimony, they insisted, was crucial. I had spent weeks with trauma counselors, learning to separate what I could not change from what I needed to say. Even now, my voice still rasped with the scars on my throat, but I had long since mastered the art of using my notebook, scrawling answers when spoken words would not come. Slowly, the questions began. First the routine: what's your name, your age, who was with you that night? Each answer felt like lacing up armor, defenses against the next barrage. Attorneys walked me through that winter night step by step, not for the first time, but never more public or final. Occasionally they apologized, their faces taut. "Can you tell us what happened in the bedroom?" I stared at the grain of the wooden witness rail and found the memory. The knife's glint, the hush after Katie's last breath, the paralyzing mixture of terror and shame. Speaking it aloud did not make it easier, but it made it real again. For the benefit of every ear in that room, I traded away a measure of my privacy so Katie would not become just another statistic, anonymous in the shadow of a monster. On the defense's end, the questioning was sharper, more clinical. Tommy's lawyer tried to challenge my certainty, picking at details, exploring whether trauma had muddled my memory. Was I really sure it was Tommy? Could I have confused his face in the dim light? Did I have something against him before that night? I watched the jury for any flicker of disbelief, desperately hoping my tears wouldn't be mistaken for confusion or fabrication. Still, the prosecutor's gentle redirection always brought me back. They showed the sketch I'd helped create, the notes from that night written in my unsteady hand, the matching fingerprints and timeline of Tommy's whereabouts. Piece by piece, my story dovetailed with the facts, each word a thread tying the horror unavoidably to the man seated just feet away, his eyes cold, jaw clenched, as if daring me to waver. My knees bounced under the table. There were moments I wanted to hide, to scream that this was too much, that no child should have to relive their worst nightmare under neon lights and the gaze of strangers. Yet each time, I remembered Mrs. Harris's slumped figure in the front row, my mom's unwavering grip, and above all, Katie's memory. I was not only fighting for myself, but for every family that ever trusted that evil could be recognized before harm was done. As testimony continued, expert witnesses filled in gaps my account could not. Forensic technicians described the gathering of hairs and fibers, police explained the break-in routine that had allowed Tommy opportunity. Psychologists testified about memory under trauma, confirming that what I described was heartbreakingly consistent with both survivor behavior and child witness reliability. These layers insulated my words, not as a shield from pain, but as a reinforcement that truth matters even when it hurts. Perhaps the hardest moment was when they played the taped interview from the hospital. The room was silent except for my ragged childhood voice describing, between gasps, the darkness, the sharp sting, the way the monster's shadow split the moonlight. I almost couldn't look at my own face, pale and bandaged on the screen, but it was there for all to see. I had survived, and I could not be silenced. If there was a power in being a child witness, it was this, bearing my scars openly enough that no one could ever again claim they didn't see what horror looked like up close. Every day on the stand chipped away at my defenses, but also at the defense's case. More than once I noticed the jury's faces shift, from wary to sympathetic to openly angry at Tommy's calculated betrayals. There is something about the truth, spoken plainly and without adult polish, that cuts through even the thickest skepticism. My favorite teacher from Del Rio was in the courtroom, and when I met her eyes after especially hard questions, she nodded, just slightly, reminding me that courage isn't about not being afraid, but refusing to let fear win. Closing arguments brought every eye in the room to the children in the story, the grief of Mrs. Harris, the resolve in my own mother, my sisters huddled in the back row. The prosecutor finished by reminding everyone that justice didn't belong to the loudest voice but to the clearest memory, the honest account of a child who witnessed and survived. When the jury retired, suspense carved hours into days. I did not sleep. My mom sat by my hospital bed that night, whispering over and over, "You did it. You did enough." The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. There was a hush, then a rush of sound, people sobbing, others clapping, and my name on everyone's lips repeated as something both fragile and fierce. The judge's voice, solemn and final, pronounced the sentence, "Death row." As I looked at Tommy for what I hoped would be the last time, I saw not a monster but a hollow man, denied power by the very truth he tried so hard to erase. But a trial's end is not quite the end for a witness. Reporters clamored to interview me, lawyers and counselors continued to check in, and the quiet moments were laced with ghosts of courtroom questions. Still, stepping out of the courthouse that day, I felt a kind of victory, not for vengeance, but for the act of standing up, of forcing the world to hear the pain, to name the wound, and to swear hopefully that such a story would never quietly repeat itself again. Looking back, the courtroom was more than a place of reckoning. It was where I learned, painfully and in public, that my voice, no matter how small or damaged, carried power. Being a young witness meant reliving a nightmare, but it also meant transforming it into a beacon, for justice, for healing, for a future where children are not left to suffer in silence. I will always carry the scars, the nightmares, the shaking hands, the relentless echo of my own testimony, but I also hold deep pride in what standing in that witness box meant, not just for Katie or myself, but for every child who needs the world to believe them. In the end, the power of a young witness is not in how much horror she can recount, but in the hope she forces the world to see, hope that something will finally change, that someone will finally listen, and that no matter what evil tries, truth can and will be spoken, even through the quiet, steady voice of a child who refuses to forget. Epilogue and Scars That Never Heal. The story was supposed to end when the killer was caught and justice finally served. In all the books and movies I devoured growing up, that was when the clouds vanished and the hero walked away bathed in golden light, healed, stronger, whole. In reality, it doesn't work like that. Not for me. Not for any of us left behind by violence. After the trial, our family stepped out of the courthouse into a world that looked the same but felt completely transformed. Television crews had packed up, neighbors started going back to their old routines, the Harris family planted new flowers under their porch, and teachers welcomed my sisters and me with forced smiles and fragile attempts at normalcy. But the scars did not simply fade because the legal system stamped closure on a case file. The pain moved in silence and made a permanent home beneath our skin. Nights were the hardest. If the daytime let me pretend, nighttime snatched every scrap of pretense away. I'd lie awake and listen, to the soft snores of my sisters, the creaks of shifting timbers, the wind brushing the windows. At the edge of sleep, the past would flood in, the glint of the killer's knife, the suffocating silence, Katie's lifeless form beside me. Most times there was no warning before my chest seized with panic and I was back inside that room, powerless and unseen. Some nights I'd stumble from bed and sit in the hallway, knees pulled to my chest, counting my breaths. Sometimes Mom would find me and hold me until dawn crept through the blinds. Sometimes I faced the darkness alone. Therapy became a regular part of my life, not just for me but for my sisters and Mom too. Sometimes I resented it. What good were words for wounds you can't stitch? but over time, I learned small ways to name what sliced at me from inside. Terms like PTSD, hypervigilance, and survivor's guilt became as familiar as knotted shoelaces. My therapist helped me map out each trigger: the sound of footsteps in the hall, the smell of antiseptic at a doctor's office, the flash of camera bulbs at school assemblies. We built rituals, journaling before bed, making safety plans, teaching my body to unclench when the world felt unsafe. Progress was uneven, always 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but it was measurable. I could sometimes go a whole week without nightmares. I even felt curiosity edge out fear when talking to new people at school, but healing never looked the way adults promised. People said time dulled pain. They didn't mention that time could also sharpen grief, twisting small moments into reminders. A sudden laugh in the cafeteria might bring a memory looping back, sharp as broken glass. Christmas mornings, birthday cakes, any normal milestone always seemed to echo with the absence of Katie's laugh and the innocence I could never reclaim. I figured out how to smile for photographs, but always noticed the flicker of worry in my mother's eyes, the too careful way neighbors asked if we were okay, the tight-lipped silence whenever strangers whispered about what happened. My relationships all changed, sometimes for the better. My mom and I, thrown together by survival, built a blunt, honest trust that wasn't there before. My sisters still ran to me in storms, but now they understood why I drew the curtains tight at night and double-checked every lock. Our family shared a language of scars, but outside our home, everything was more brittle. Some kids avoided me, unsure of what to say. Others clung too closely as if friendship could save them from the darkness I'd survived. Even the teachers, no matter how compassionate, walked on eggshells, never quite letting me forget I was marked by something they feared more than they understood. Pain came in layers, sometimes hollow and silent, sometimes erupting without cause. For the Harris family, the wounds festered in other ways. Mrs. Harris stopped hosting sleepovers for a long while. Her laughter became smaller, edged with sorrow. She filled her days with volunteering, organizing neighborhood watches and self-defense classes, maybe hoping to reclaim a sense of safety for the next child who might need it. Our families drifted between closeness and distance, each of us clinging to the pieces of hope and trust that survived the storm. Years passed. I grew taller, my sisters changed schools. My mother took a job in a new town. At each step, the world expected us to move on, graduate, make friends, outgrow the shadows. Most people assume healing is a straight line, but grief is circular. I found myself back at the beginning with each anniversary, each news report of violence against a child. Sometimes the media would dig up our story for special coverage. My hands would tremble when I saw Tommy's name printed in bold or found interview requests in our mailbox. Every time I thought I was done being just the survivor, the world reminded me otherwise. And yet, as the distance from that night grew, something else quietly took root. I discovered that survival was not about forgetting the darkness but learning how to live with it. I used my story, hard as it was, to work with organizations that support young trauma survivors. I spoke with lawmakers about victim rights, sometimes shaking so badly I thought I'd faint, but always refusing to let my voice be silenced again. I sent letters to other kids who wrote for help, promising that scars tell a story, that their pain did not make them weak or broken. I let myself miss Katie rather than filter her out. Grief, I came to realize, is love with nowhere to go, and I had to let it move through me rather than bottling it away. The scars are real. I still flinch at certain sounds, still pause before trusting anyone new. There will always be a part of me that checks the shadows, that knows monsters sometimes wear familiar faces. My scars aren't just on my neck or arms, they live in the way I say goodbye, in every locked window, in the softness I offer to kids who feel unseen. I am not healed. I am not the same girl I was before Texas, before that night, but I am alive and I am heard. My pain, heavy as it sometimes feels, cannot erase my hope for the future or my stubborn belief in small, everyday joys. There's a strength in admitting the wounds don't vanish, that you can build a beautiful, messy, meaningful life with scars that never quite fade.